The Geordie accent is one of the United Kingdom's most recognisable regional accents. Hailing from the city of Newcastle upon Tyne and its environs in the northeast of England, it shares many features with the neighbouring accents and dialects around Sunderland and Durham to the south, Northumberland to the north and west, and with Scots spoken in Scotland. As such, some of the dialect words used in Geordie are also known to people from other areas. Nevertheless, these words allude to the history of the northeast region and often differ sharply from Standard English. Let's take a look at where some of these come from in today's video. The first layer of Geordie is the same as that of Standard English, the Old English language spoken by the Anglo-Saxons from around the 5th to the 12th century. The northeast fell into the aptly named Kingdom of Northumbria, which encompassed much of northern England and southern Scotland. Probably the most famous Anglo-Saxon Northumbrian was a monk called Bede, who wrote in his ecclesiastical history of the English people that Northumbria was largely settled by Angles from modern-day Denmark. Bede wrote his famous works on the banks of the Tyne at Jarrow, and may therefore be considered something of a proto-Geordie speaker himself. While he wrote his work in Latin, the spoken language of the Anglo-Saxons was called Old English. Even in Old English there were dialects. So in Northumbria, the people are said to have spoken a Northumbrian dialect based on the evidence of language in manuscripts and inscriptions from the north. The very earliest bit of Northumbrian Old English is called Cadman's Hymn from the 7th century. Here already we can see some differences to the other Old English dialects like West Saxon spoken in the south. For example, in Northumbrian Old English, you get far less palatalization. The linguistic process which gives English the sounds ch, y and j, where other Germanic languages have k and g. That's why in Scots they refer to the kirk and the brig, so the old Northumbrian forms, rather than the church and the bridge. In County Durham, some speakers still said kirk at the end of the 19th century, but on Tyneside it's mostly said as chorch. The majority of Geordie dialect words have their origin in this Anglian form of Old English. These are just a few examples. Ben, meaning child or children, from Old English bean. Larn, meaning teach, from Old English leran, which obviously modern English is to learn. Wife, which means woman as well as wife in Geordie, from Old English wif or weef, meaning married or unmarried. Axe instead of ask, from the Old English axian. Deen, meaning wood, from the Old English dene. And war for hour, from the Old English ura. This can mean both my or our, as in warlas, meaning my wife or my girlfriend. Another category are words that in Geordie are pronounced more closely to the Old English pronunciation than their modern English counterparts. These can include oot, out, from the Old English oot, toon, town or sometimes specifically Newcastle, from Old English toon, ad or ald, from Old English ald, rang, wrong, from Old English rang, which itself is actually a borrowing from Old Norse vranger, but I think probably the Geordie here has come through the Old English because you've got rang instead of vrang, which you might get if you had the Old Norse being the source. And finally, lang instead of long, from Old English lang. Now in the mid-9th century, the great, sometimes called the Great Heathen Army from Scandinavia, would conquer the Kingdom of Northumbria and proceed to settle in the region, which is what we read in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 876, where it says, Halfdan shared out the land of the Northumbrians, and they proceeded to plough and support themselves. Based on regional dialect words, place names and archaeology, most of this settlement happened to the south of the River Tees, particularly in parts of Yorkshire. Here the dialect of Old English was strongly influenced by the Old Norse language of the Scandinavians, a fact that can still be seen in modern English dialects there to this day. The same can't be said for the northeast, however, as while some settlement of Old Norse speakers is thought to have taken place, it was on a much smaller scale. This meant that the dialect varieties of Northumbrian Old English to the north and south of the Tees started to grow apart over the following centuries. It's either through contact with these Norse-influenced Old English speakers or direct contact with Old Norse speakers that the ancestors of the speakers of Geordie would also inherit some words of Scandinavian. Here are a few examples, though given that Old English and Old Norse were quite closely related languages, some of these might have come from Old English, or they might have two explanations for their origin. Gang or gan, meaning go, from Old Norse gang. Old English has gan, but because you in older forms see that gang form with the final g, then I think it might be from Old Norse rather than Old English there. Jem, meaning home, from potentially Old Norse heim, or from Old English ham. Ket, meaning sweets, from Old Norse kjøtt, meaning meat. Skran, meaning food, but also the verb to eat, from Old Norse skram, which meant something like rubbish or marine waste. This one isn't quite sure because it might actually be from a later etymology meaning something like a tab of food, but then that in turn might still come from the Old Norse. Bait, meaning food, especially a packed lunch taken to work, from Old Norse beita, meaning to bite or to feed. Muckle, meaning big, from Old Norse mikil, or from Old English muchel. Again, because of that, muchel is the West Saxon form with partalization. The Northumbrian form may already have been muckle, so in actual fact it might just be from Northumbrian Old English, but we're not really too certain. And finally, lek, meaning to play, from Old Norse leika. From about 1100 onwards, linguists talk about the Middle English period of the language's development. With the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the Old English language was influenced by new words from Norman French, just as it had been influenced by Old Norse words before. Generally, these influences were felt much more strongly in the south of the country than in the north. Northumberland in particular remained a border zone between the kingdoms of England and Scotland, and was largely rural throughout much of the Middle Ages. This might have helped the dialect be more conservative in maintaining some words and pronunciations that died out elsewhere in England. Likewise, contact with Scots speakers to the north also might have helped keep common words in circulation. Some Middle English words no longer used in the standard English language have survived in Geordie or have acquired other meanings. These include bonny, meaning beautiful or pretty, from the French word bon, meaning good. Brer, to beat probably someone or something up, from Middle French breyer, meaning to crush or to grind. And the hoppens, which is a kind of fair, probably from Middle English hoppen, meaning to dance or to hop. These are sort of quite regional fairs that you see in Northumberland, and there's a big one in Gateshead that happens. So there had already been a lot of settlement on the site of Newcastle since Roman times. The name of Newcastle itself was given when a Norman motte and bailey fortification was built there in 1080 by Robert Curthose, the son of William the Conqueror, in order to subdue the north, which had been quite rebellious. Now, the River Tyne was mainly used to ship the coal that was dug out of mines in rural Northumberland to Newcastle and then throughout Europe. In 1530, a monopoly on this transport was given to Newcastle's hostmen, powerful burgesses who transformed the riverside settlement into a major town because of their monopoly on this trade. Now, despite being ravished by successive plagues in the 1630s and then being besieged and captured by the Scots during the Civil War, Newcastle managed to attract mariners and traders from around the North Sea for centuries and continued to do so after this period. So it's possible that some of these Old Norse words were really brought to Newcastle by Danish, Norwegian and Icelandic mariners instead. Or perhaps it's just the fact that words like ben, ket and gang were fashionable and useful and could be understood by sailors as well as by the locals, which meant they maintained their usefulness as part of the dialect. Now, already at this time, Geordie was seen as being one of the most distinctive accents in England, and it's described by John Hart in 1569, who says, "If anyone were minded to Newcastle upon Tyne or Bodman in Cornwall to write his or print his mind there, who should justly blame him for his orthography to serve his neighbours according to their mother speech?" So clearly Newcastle and the accent there in Cornwall were seen as being the sort of strangest to the ears of the London-born elite at the time. Now, one of the explanations for the name Geordie itself is the city's refusal to side with the Jacobite Old Pretender, James Stuart, in 1715, and they were therefore nicknamed for the British King George. This is actually even remembered in an old Geordie song, which I'll try in my best sort of 18th century Geordie. And up with Geordie, Kinmilk Geordie, he's drunken the maltman's ale, but he'd be naked to hint the wicket and tugged to hint his grey mare's tail. In order to guard against possible Jacobite attacks, Allied Dutch soldiers were actually stationed in Newcastle and other parts of the region in 1745, when the Old Pretender's son would also make a bid for the throne by raising troops from the Scottish Highland clans and then coming down into England and trying to take the throne. Now, some of these Dutch soldiers are known to have deserted and then stayed on Tyneside much longer, probably marrying into the local community. Now, Newcastle also had important trading connections with the Low Countries throughout much of its history, and it's possible they also left their mark on the dialect, although they might well have had other origins, possibly from earlier Flemish migrants and merchants speaking Middle Dutch, which was then taken up into Middle English and then came into Geordie that way. But in either way, it links back to the Dutch language in some way or form. Some of these Geordie words from Dutch might include crack, meaning talking, from Dutch kraken, meaning to crack, hoi, meaning to throw, from Dutch gooi. Now, of course, that initial h isn't present in English, so it's quite possible that h went to h and became hoi. Kiek, meaning to look or peep, from Dutch kijken, meaning to look. Stot, meaning to bounce, from Dutch stotteren. In fact, the Middle Dutch form stoten, stotten might actually be even closer, and may also be the etymology for a kind of Geordie bread called a stotty. And kip, meaning sleep, from Middle Dutch kip or kipje, which might have been a hut or a bundle of hides upon which or in which to sleep. This new age of discovery also brought new words and ideas. For example, baccy, meaning tobacco, a tab, meaning a cigarette, and chud or chuddy, meaning chewing gum. By the dawn of the 19th century, Geordie already had an acquired character, with the influences we've mentioned from Northumbrian Old English and some Old Norse words, continuation of some Middle French and English words that fell out of fashion elsewhere, and new words coming in through its maritime connections. The booming shipbuilding industry, as well as the coal mines on Tyneside, helped attract labourers from other parts of Britain to settle in Newcastle and the local area in the 18th century. In particular, there were large communities of migrants from Ireland and the Scottish lowlands. So for some time, lots of different dialects could be heard in Newcastle, though by the end of the 18th century, these seem to have coalesced into one dialect with a highly standardised grammar, just as in Standard or RP English. Ultimately, it's this process that really forms the basis of the sounds we associate with Geordie today. Due to racist attitudes towards Irish immigrants, these communities were often ghettoised, and so Irish Gaelic and Irish English had very little influence on the Geordie dialect. Scots, on the other hand, did have a big influence. The linguist Joan Beale writes about this contact. The strongest influence on the Tyneside and Northumberland is undoubtedly from lowland Scots, but this can hardly be called an outside influence given the common origin of these dialects. It must rather be said that the continuing close relationship between Scots and Northumbrians has served to maintain and reinforce the linguistic similarities between their dialects. This renewed contact with speakers of Scots, the other language or dialect descended from Northumbrian Old English, probably helped Geordie retain words and other features shared by both that fell out of fashion in other dialects in England. It's probably thanks to this big mixing of labourers from different parts of Britain that has led to Geordie being seen as a very working class dialect, to be heard doon the pit and on the docks. Some of the words relevant to this period might include afore, meaning before, from the Scots afore, fray or fray, meaning from, possibly from the Scots fray and fay. Although it's worth noting that in my experience, these words aren't really used anymore by Geordie speakers, though if you look at Geordie texts from the 19th century, you do actually find them. A lot of Geordie words relate to this period of increased industry and mining, as well as working on the docks, and some of these might include mara, meaning mate, possibly from the word marrow, which initially referred to a working partner doing the same shift down the mine shaft, and so you'd be close as bone marrow, which then became mara. Clarty, meaning dirty or muddy, which initially meant something like to smear on. There was a verb called beclart, which then in itself takes on the meaning of being muddy. And finally, hacky, which when I was growing up, that was always used as a dirty look, but in other areas it could mean anything that was dirty, which came from the word hack, which in Geordie used to mean to cough harshly, which was probably relating to being down the mine and working and then getting a bad cough from hacking or something along those lines. Another category of words worth mentioning are those derived from the Romani language, several of which are staples in modern Geordie mouths. During the 19th century, many Romanis in the northeast would be out on the road in the summer months and seek lodgings within Newcastle itself in the winter, perhaps facilitating exchange of vocabulary with the sedentary Geordies. Over time, these travellers would sometimes integrate into the population and remain settled on Tyneside. Some Geordie words derived from Anglo-Romani include gadji, meaning man, from Romani gadjo, meaning a non-Romani person, dik, meaning a look, from Romani dikel, meaning to see, bari, meaning excellent, from Romani bari, meaning big or great, and chava, an unruly youth, either from Romani charver, which means prostitute, or more likely chavi, meaning a friend. There are also some words and phrases about Romanis that are used in Geordie. There's the word fa, which means a gypsy, from the name of a prominent Romani clan called the Fars, although this can be seen as being derogatory today. And finally, there is jip, which means trouble or nagging, which is used in certain contexts, like the phrase, "You're always gien as jip," which means you're always nagging me. It's possible that this jip comes from gypsy or from Egyptian, although ultimately the word gypsy comes from Egyptian anyway, and that it has a negative connotation. But in any case, these words from Romani are quite interesting that they have made their way into the Geordie dialect as well, and that many of these words are still used today. So from the Northumbrian dialect of Old English, the vernacular of England's northeast has changed quite a bit. Even so, we can still see some of that earliest influence in the words that we use in dialect today, just as in the standard language. Quite a few words may be entirely or partly derived from Old Norse, or perhaps snuck into the dialect through contact with sailors from Scandinavia in later times, or were actually from the similar Old English forms. While Geordie generally has more Old English derived forms than Standard English, there are some words from French as well. Dutch may also have left its mark on Geordie through the centuries, though as ever it's hard to know for certain where some of these older words came from, and the ones provided in this video are just possible etymologies. The age of industry brought migrants from across Britain and Ireland to Newcastle, as well as new words. This led to a great degree of levelling and standardisation in Geordie, which perhaps is why the dialect has in many ways survived in the region to a greater or lesser degree. Most people will at least know quite a few stock phrases or words, even if they don't speak in broad dialect themselves. From the 16th century onwards, Romani speaking Anglo-Romani also added words to the dialect. So, as much as I can make out, that's the history of the Geordie dialect spoken in Newcastle and Tyneside. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you'd like to know anything else, then I'd say leave a comment or share some information. If you are yourself a speaker of Geordie, how did you think I did, or are there certain words that you would add to this list with interesting etymologies or origins? Or if you're a smoggy or a Macam or from further up in Northumberland, how similar is this to the way that you would speak at home, and do you recognise many of these words yourself? Or if you're from further afield, I'm always interested to hear more about which dialect words you have in your own dialect and where these come from themselves. Anyway, for now, all I'll say is gan canny, and I'll see you soon. Ta-da.